And it says, 人有情，草木有情，情情相连，两相依。Now, let me declare, that was the first time I saw that sort of notice. I didn't know that this type of notice was everywhere in China. Right? I didn't know that. So for me, it's very striking. And I thought, wow, what a poetic notice. So as I was standing there in sort of mild amazement, enjoying that very poetic notice, Theo Hermans, this translation scholar from England, came up to me and said, "What are you looking at?" And then, what am I? What should I say? So Peter Newmark came to my mind. Text type. So, right, this is a notice. So I'll just translate it as a notice. So I should tell him this is a notice. And I know that the next question he's going to ask me would be, what's the notice about? Why have you been standing there, in sort of absorbed, sort of appreciation? And then I thought, oh, whatever Peter Newmark says, I'm not going to just tell Theo Hermans that the notice said, step off the grass or keep away from the grass, right? Otherwise, it would be really stupid. So I said, whatever Peter Newmark has taught me, I'm going to take it as a different type of text. It's not going to be an advertisement. So I said, come what may, I'm going to translate this as a poem. Then eventually I decided to do that, and that helped me solve the problem. So initially, you could say I was taking translation as a craft or as a professional and trying to do it very professionally, saying that this is a notice. And then I decided not to, and I was quite happy with my decision. So that's my way of answering the question.
Thank you. I would go back to the beginning and say it's all of the above. To some extent. As primarily a literary translator, I never considered my work as a profession in the sense that I would make a living doing it. I make a living teaching. And I teach students who want to do translation as a profession. And that often involves doing texts that are not literary. In the early days, I did my fair share of politics and economics and government and commerce and the rest of it. And I think I had a similar approach. I always tried to take these texts as literary texts. It was the only way I could get through them, make them interesting, and do a good job. I would say, again, art, craft, profession, it's all of these. Science, perhaps when we're getting into tools and the rest of it, you've got a little bit of technology there. And Kung Fu, I like this idea, sort of adapting to the situation, adapting to the text, being able to respond to it. I hate to say it intuitively, but perhaps that's what we're looking at here. So I would say all of the above.
Okay, well, the second of my topics is what role do translation theory, whatever that is, and translation studies, whatever that is, play in the training of translators? Are there some types of translation theory that are more useful than others? Are there any textbooks that teachers of translation have found beneficial? Which of the current gurus would be helpful for our students? And by gurus, I mean people like Mona Baker or Lawrence Venuti or, the people on the circuit. Is it true that without a theoretical framework, it is impossible to discuss a translation profitably? So these are all, it's a series of questions that revolves around the role of theory in teaching translation and practicing translation. So in a sense, this is the key question of the evening. And we'll start with John.
I think it goes back to love-hate again. The whole profession and the teaching of translation, we have this huge dichotomy between theory and practice. As I think most professional translators, now I'm calling myself a professional translator, my age, I'm more or less self-taught. I started by studying Chinese and found out that I could make money early on by translating. I didn't go to school for it. I didn't study theory. I sort of learned by doing. I translated for over 10 years before I ever taught translation, and it was probably several years into teaching before I read any theory. And I managed to teach without theory. I think in an academic setting, where I teach, we have a very practical, hands-on sort of approach to translation. If we deal with theory, it comes up in the course of practice. How does this relate to practice? Most of my work, again, is training people to be translators, actually doing it. The interesting thing, I think, about teaching Chinese to English translation, and it's much different from other languages. I talk to my European colleagues and they say, well, no one ever translates into their second language. You only translate into your first language. Well, in the Chinese English market, it's the opposite. I would say 98% of the work is being done by non-native speakers of English. And how do you get someone to a level of proficiency? It's by doing, repeatedly doing, working through different text types of different levels of difficulty. It's this continued practice, a sort of master-apprentice relationship. And in 2 years, I think most of the students are ready to go out and do this sort of work. The progress is amazing. You can see it. But again, there's very little theory involved in it. It's basically practice. In terms of gurus, I would say I use Peter Newmark probably more than anyone else. I've written the textbook of Chinese English translation, and the model is Newmark. And again, as I said, I think it's you can profitably discuss translation without a lot of theory. For me, when you're discussing a translation, it's basically close reading and developing writing skills. You know, if you can become a good reader, a good close reader, you can develop your active use of a language, you can probably become a good translator. And theory, I think, has very little to do with that. I think I'm just going to leave it there.
I think we have 3 terms here. One is translation theory, one is translation studies, and then one is the training of translators. So these 3 terms, how do we, I mean, if we want to do a mind map, how do we put them? So maybe for me, is translation studies at the top, and then under that, you have a number of things, one of which is translation theory, and then another would be the training of translators, together with a number of other things as well. And those of you who are familiar with theory, we know that I'm talking about the map produced by James Holmes about the discipline of translation. That is, translation as an academic discipline offered in the university, and what rationale, what justifications there must be for translation to become not just a craft or not just a skill, but an academic discipline in its own right. But I'm not going to go into that, but that's how I would divide these 3, how I would organize these 3 terms.